Hello, my name is Phil Easter, historian and writer from Baltimore, Maryland, also known as the Amazing Memory Man. We are recording tonight on Friday, February 3rd, 2023. In a few weeks, it will be the President's Day celebration on Monday, February 20th, and tonight I'm going to share stories of the two greatest American presidents. George Washington was born in Virginia on February 22nd, 1732. He came from a wealthy background, a planter, and as a young man, he studied many subjects, but at the age of 23, early in what was later called the French and Indian War, he was organized a company of Virginians who were allied to the British Army. So he actually fought for the British Army in the French and Indian War, which might surprise some people who have not studied history real well. Most everybody knows he became the top general in the American Revolution and then became the first president. But actually, some years before, when he was a young man, he fought in the French and Indian War for the British. There was a skirmish somewhere in Pennsylvania where he really did not lead his men very well, they say, and I think he was actually captured by the French for a short period of time, and they let him go, and he went back to Virginia somewhat disgraced, and he never thought he'd probably be in the military again. But indeed, some years later, when the American Revolution began, he became a general in the American Army, of course, fighting against the British. And it's interesting now that on July 4th, 1776, he was not one of those who signed the Declaration of Independence of Philadelphia, as so many of the other famous founding fathers did, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, to name a few. But that's because he was out in the field leading the army, the Continental Army, as it was called, fighting against the British Army. During the American Revolution, some high-ranking soldiers from Europe, such as Count Pulaski from Poland and the Marquis de Lafayette from France, came over and several thousand troops, and they trained together with the American armies under George Washington and some other generals. And at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777 is often considered the turning point of the American Revolution. And so George Washington then became the top general. Certainly by the end of the American Revolution, he was the top general of the army. And at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781, the revolution came to an end when the British general surrendered to George Washington. There's a famous painting of that surrender, except it wasn't really the top British general. He actually sent his second in command. He was too embarrassed to surrender directly to George Washington. He stayed in his tent, they said, and he sent his second in command to hand the sword to George Washington, which was the custom of many armies in those days. When a general lost, he would meet the opposing general and literally take out his sword and surrender to the general directly. But the American Revolution ended, and then over the next several years, the 13 colonies becoming the 13 states of the United States formed the Constitution. And in 1789, George Washington was elected the first president. And his inauguration day was April 30th, 1789. Now, for the first several years, the capital of the United States moved from New York then to Philadelphia. And actually, at the time of the Constitutional Convention before that, what they considered the capital changed. Even some very small cities like York, Pennsylvania, even now not a large city, but then very small, was the capital for a while. And even the capital of Maryland, Annapolis, where I should have mentioned before he became president, when he was still the top general of the army, that's where he resigned his commission in 1783. And that was noted by many people, a remarkable thing, that he was the top general of the army. He had the army under his command, but he believed in a democratic process. And even King George III of England, even he said, if George Washington does this, he will be the greatest man who ever lived. Very few times in history did a powerful man with an army under him just lay down the power and return to civilian life. Over 2,000 years ago, in ancient Rome, there was a great general named Cincinnatus. He was a farmer by profession, but when Rome faced an enemy, the Senate asked him to be the top general of the army, and so they defeated the enemy, but after that, Cincinnatus just returned to be a simple farmer for the rest of his life. And so George Washington, the first president, served 2 terms, but towards the end of his second term, he decided he would not run again. He thought 2 terms was enough for an American president. He could have run again. It was not till many years later that the law changed. A few years after Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945, the law was changed that you cannot serve more than 2 consecutive terms. Franklin Roosevelt was elected 4 times, actually, 1932, 36, 40, and 44, during much of the Great Depression and most of World War II. But George Washington in the 1700s decided 2 terms he suggested 2 terms was enough for a president. And so he left office on March 4th, 1797, when John Adams became the 2nd president. George Washington died 2 years later at age 67. Now, here in Baltimore, we have a beautiful monument, as you can see here, this photograph of the Washington Monument, Baltimore, perhaps not as well known as the more famous one in our nation's capital, but certainly, I think, a very beautiful monument, and it actually has a statue of George on the top, as opposed to the one in D.C. that just comes up to a point. And for much of my life, I lived in the area of Baltimore called Mount Vernon Place for most of the first 34 years of my life. And in 1985, I was living in an apartment building just 1 block from the monument, and I often would take walks. I was also a long-distance runner back then, and sometimes I'd go out for runs in that area, as well as other parts of Baltimore, but often just walking around the area. And on Monday, April 29th, 1985, I was walking by the monument at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon with my mom, and my mom was 70 years old at the time, and she had Parkinson's disease, and she could not walk too far, but it was still good for her to get out once in a while. So we're out for a short walk that day, and as many times before, I noticed that there were certain inscriptions on the monument, on different sides of the monument, his birthday and death day, which were correct, and some of the battles that he won. But on the western base, which is this base here, were supposedly the right inauguration date that he became president, and over here, the day he left presidency, which, as I said before, was March 4th, 1797, when John Adams became president. And that is correct. But the starting date inscribed right here, I looked over there that day and I said, "Oh my God, it's wrong." The monument had been built almost 150 years before, and they put up the wrong inauguration date. And here is how it would look if you stand very close to the monument, where it says it was President of the United States, but 4 March 1789. It should read 30 April 1789, because that's the exact day he became president. Even though the year is correct, the day and month is wrong. And that's probably why I guess no one noticed for so long. I mean, a lot of people aren't very good at memorizing exact dates. And even if they are, they usually think the year is good enough. but I care about so many exact dates in history, day, month, and year. I've memorized quite a number of events in U.S. and world history, in sports history, and many events in my personal life many years ago, even the exact day, not just the year something happened. And so I called the Evening Sun newspaper, and sure enough, soon thereafter, a reporter came to my house to interview me. And a few months later, on July 8th, 1985, this two-page article here, I was happy to be right underneath an article about the current president at that time, was Ronald Reagan. Interesting, even back in 1985, he labeled certain countries terror nations that very much have been for many years since then, it just so happens. But anyway, the article, my words, "Oh my God, it's wrong," and then "monumental error in the city." And the second page of the article went into many exact dates that I know off the top of my head without looking at any notes in front of me. I was 32 years old then, as you see in that photograph. So it was interesting. I was to make front page of a major newspaper for discovering a mistake on a major monument, and I was very proud of that, and so were my family and friends. And I also had several radio and television interviews since that time, sometimes partly about the mistake on the monument, as well as examples of my outstanding memory talent. And that again was 1985, which is now 38 years ago, that was. At that time, the city indicated they might change it, but they haven't. Anyhow, a monumental error, for sure, getting the wrong date of the first president. Now, his second inauguration 4 years later, in 1793, was on March 4th, but the very first one was April 30th, and that's why that's wrong. The only time an American president was ever inaugurated April 30th. As many of you know, Inauguration Day is now January 20 every 4 years. Since 1937, a little less than 100 years, it has been January 20th. But for much of American history, it was March 4th, from George Washington's second inauguration through Franklin Roosevelt's first, on March 4, 1933, when FDR was inaugurated the first time. That's the last time March 4th was presidential inauguration day. Naturally, when tragedies happen, a president dies in office, or in the case of Richard Nixon resigning in 1974, well, of course, the vice president becomes president immediately. But we're talking about scheduled inauguration days, which means after a president wins the election in November, then the following year, calendar year, it is now January 20, but for many years it was March 4th, and that was a good 4 months after the November election. Now it's about 2.5 months, which I think is just about right. You need some transition period, but I think 4 months would be pretty long. George Washington, great leader of the American Revolution and the first president of the United States. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in the state of Kentucky. Yes, he really was born in a log cabin, that is true. And he really, in his background, he only had 2 years of formal education. Just 2 years he went to school, but he apparently learned to read well enough, learned to read very well, and when he was only about 10 or 11 years old, his mother died, and not long after that, his father and Lincoln and his brother, they moved to Indiana, the state of Indiana, for several years. And then later, Lincoln moved to Illinois, where he lived most of his life. He lived many years in the town of Springfield, and in his mid-20s, he passed the bar exam and became a lawyer. Later, he became the captain of the Illinois militia, as they called it then, and he saw brief action in a conflict called the Black Hawk War, where they fought against some Indians in that area. Now, really, that was sort of like the National Guard now. When they used the term militia then, it was usually a state militia. like what we call the National Guard at this time. Not the same exactly as what when you hear in the television news about militia groups nowadays. It's not the same thing. These militia were very much connected to the state government of Illinois. And then he ran for Congress at one point, and he served just 2 years in Congress, one term. In 1858, he ran for senator in the state of Illinois, but was defeated by Douglas. So Lincoln was a Republican. The Republican Party had just formed a few years before. In 1856, they ran a candidate named Fremont for president, but lost. So even though Lincoln lost that 1858 Senate election to Douglas, it gave him a certain popularity. They debated each other a number of times. And so 1860, the Republican convention was in New York City. And there, a number of people, older people than Lincoln and better known in the Republican Party, were considered for nomination for president, but they couldn't agree on someone. But Lincoln was the second choice for a while there, many people, and finally they decided, well, maybe Lincoln could be the nominee, and so he was declared the Republican nominee for president. The 1860 presidential election had Lincoln, the Republican, Stephen Douglas, the Democrat. Breckinridge was a party called Southern Democrats at that time, and John Bell, the Constitution Party. On November 6, 1860, the presidential election was held, and Abraham Lincoln won 18 states. Yet of the overall popular vote, he received 39%, but that was still more than any other candidate, and he did win the Electoral College quite handily. He won enough for the larger states, the states that had the most electoral votes. And so he would take office on March 4th, 1861. As he came through Baltimore to change trains, because at that time there was one railroad that came from a certain distance in other states, but you had to change trains in Baltimore to go on to Washington, D.C., to another station. And there was some fear for his life even at that time. Many people in the southern states did not like Lincoln. As a matter of fact, he did not win a single southern state in the election. And there was a man named Pinkerton, a detective from New York, was Lincoln's security guard on that trip, the train trip from Baltimore to Washington. And then Lincoln took office officially on March 4th, 1861. Some states had already seceded in the South, and by June of that year, there were 11 states that called themselves the Confederate States of America. But only 1 month after Lincoln took office, on April 12th, 1861, South Carolina was a state that had Fort Sumter, an American Army fort in the harbor of Charleston. And Confederate cannon opened fire on Fort Sumter on April 12th, 1861. By the next day, the Union commander, Major Anderson, ordered a surrender. None of the men had been killed, but I think some were wounded, and he knew that at some point it would be devastating. And so at the surrender ceremony, a strange thing happened that one Union soldier was accidentally killed somehow, and but it technically happened after the surrender ceremony. But then 1 week later, on April 19th, 1861, in Baltimore, there was a riot when many soldiers from Massachusetts, again, they had to change train stations. As I said before, when you came to Baltimore, there was another train that went to Washington, D.C. You had to either walk about a mile on Pratt Street or take a carriage or something. So there were thousands of Union soldiers marching through Baltimore to get to the other station. They were attacked by a pro-Confederate mob, and 12 people were killed, 4 soldiers and 8 people of the Baltimore mob that was mostly pro-Confederate. So the Civil War is really underway now, the mayor of Baltimore, Mayor Jackson, actually ordered some workers to try to destroy the telegraph lines between Baltimore and Washington and the train tracks also. He was pro-Confederate. The state of Maryland would remain Union by a thread, but there were many Confederate sympathizers here. And also the states of Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri remained Union officially, even though they were slave states. So there were 4 slave states that were actually Union states, so that might surprise some people who have not studied this era very well. Of course, all 11 Confederate states were slave states. So Lincoln early on had several things to contemplate. His main goal was to preserve the Union. He once said, if I can preserve the Union without freeing any slaves, I will do that. Or if I can preserve the Union by freeing some slaves and leaving others enslaved, I will do that. Or if I have to free all the slaves, I will do that. So eventually, that second choice is what he did. But that wasn't for almost 2 years into the war. The Union lost the Battle of Bull Run on July 21st, 1861. A number of people from Washington, D.C. came out to watch the battle, thinking it would be a quick Union victory, but the Confederate generals and their soldiers performed much better at Bull Run, and there was one general named Thomas Jackson, thereafter known as Stonewall Jackson, for his resistance to the Union forces. The Confederates won a number of early battles. Lincoln was frustrated. He changed generals several times. The top general of the Union Army, he changed several times. The Battle of Antietam was in Maryland on September 17, 1862. On that day, close to 8,000 soldiers died between the two armies. The bloodiest single day in American history ever, for one day. Now the next year, in 1863, the famous Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, somewhere around 10 to 12,000 men were killed, but that was over a 3-day period, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, over 3 days, technically. But the Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single day ever in 1862. But it was a Union victory, and a few days later, on September 22nd, 1862, Abraham Lincoln announced his plan for the Emancipation Proclamation, which would go into effect about 100 days later on New Year's Day, 1863. And still, even that period of a little over 3 months, if the Confederate States had surrendered, no slaves would have been freed. Lincoln wanted to make it clear to the Confederates that he wants to preserve the Union. And so they did not surrender, and thus on New Year's Day, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation officially went into effect, which technically freed slaves in all those states in rebellion to the Union, but not the 4 states of Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri that were Union states. That might surprise some people, but that was the situation. It would not be till several years later, when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in December 1865, that technically all slavery ended in the United States and territories thereof. But at least the emancipation, in theory, freed most black people from slavery. But again, this did not really happen until Union armies could secure certain states. And so on that day, really nobody was free, effectively speaking, because the armies didn't fight during the winter time. It took off a few months. So sometime a few months later, when Union armies would regain various parts of the states in the South, the Confederate states, other than Louisiana, they had already had control of Louisiana. But the other Confederate states, over the next several years, when Union armies would reach certain areas where there were slaves, the slaves were told they were free. But some heard about the emancipation anyhow and would run away. And this sometimes caused some problems for the Confederates because they were outnumbered anyhow by the Union overall, and local commanders would have to make decisions whether sending more troops to fight the Union soldiers or try to hunt down slaves that were fleeing. So emancipation was mostly a military and political decision. Now, it still has the effect of a very good thing, a kind thing, but just so people realize, Lincoln was mainly concerned about preserving the Union. The war ended in April of 1865, when Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant. The two generals met at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9th, 1865. It was said that journalists who watched that, newspaper writers, often said that Grant, the victor, technically, did not look as good as Robert E. Lee in defeat. One of the reasons for that was Robert E. Lee decided the night before he was going to surrender. Grant did not know that yet. Grant thought there might be a battle still to fight that day, so he was in his fatigue uniform, not his best dress uniform. Whereas Robert E. Lee wore his very best dress uniform to that surrender ceremony. That was on Palm Sunday, 1863. April 9th was Palm Sunday, 1863. Well, over the coming days, there was festivity in Washington, D.C. And on the night of April 14th, 1865, Good Friday that year, President Lincoln and his wife, Mary, went to see a play at Ford's Theater. The play was called Our American Cousin. It was about English people mostly in the story, and English actors. At about 10 o'clock that night, actor John Wilkes Booth, who was not in that play, but he was a well-known actor at that theater and in other parts of the United States. John Wilkes Booth and his brother Edwin were very well-known actors. John Wilkes was 26 years old at the time. It was said the bar that was connected to the theater, John Wilkes Booth was having a drink or two. The guard who was supposed to be guarding Lincoln came down at some point and also went there for a drink. Some people later said it's very possible those two were drinking almost side by side. John Wilkes Booth went to the presidential box with a gun and a knife. It was actually a small Derringer, which only fires one bullet at a time. But he walked right behind Lincoln and shot President Lincoln in the back of the head, to the horror of his wife and a Union Army major and his fiancée, who were also guests of Lincoln in the same presidential box. Booth then stabbed the major and wounded the major in the arm, though the major did survive. This happened at a point in the play where there was much laughter. Booth knew the script, so really some of the people in the audience didn't hear the shot. Some did, but not all. Immediately, Booth jumped to the stage, but as he did, he was wearing boots with spurs because there was a horse waiting. He had a horse waiting outside. One of his spurs caught the American flag draped there. Ironically, moments after he shot President Lincoln, he was tripped up by the American flag. He hit the stage at a bad angle and broke his leg. Still, he shouted, "Sic temper tyrannus," which is Latin for death to the tyrant. Booth escaped for a while. For some days, he and one other man could not be found. Of course, the soldiers were pursuing them. President Lincoln was taken across the street, to a house across the street. His wife and some top aides were with him. And at 7:22 a.m. on Saturday, April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. He was the 16th President of the United States. Secretary of War Stanton was in the room. There's some debate as to what he said. Some people think he said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Other people said that he said, "Now he belongs to the angels." And maybe they couldn't quite hear the word properly, but either way, it's very touching. Whether he said, "Now he belongs to the ages of time and great people in history," or if he said, "Now he belongs to the angels." The next day was Easter Sunday, a very sad Easter Sunday for America. The news spread that the president had died, and several days later, a funeral train would go from Washington, D.C. to Illinois, where he is buried in Springfield. Abraham Lincoln was 56 years old. He was president for 4 years and 1 month exactly. He was assassinated 1 month after his second inauguration. But what he did was so important to preserve the Union and free many people from slavery. Oh yes, something else he did, not quite as well known. It was Abraham Lincoln that made Thanksgiving a national holiday. Some states celebrated a kind of Thanksgiving before that, especially Massachusetts. The original story, the Pilgrims who landed there in 1620. But it was Abraham Lincoln in 1863 who declared that the last Thursday of November would be a day of national Thanksgiving. Some years later, the U.S. Congress amended that slightly and specifically said the fourth Thursday of November. Once in a while, you might get 5 Thursdays of November. So the Congress say the fourth Thursday, which we now celebrate, technically. But Lincoln is the man who had the idea of making Thanksgiving a national holiday. And of course, that same month of November, 1863, he traveled up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where that terrible battle had raged just a few months before, and gave the most famous speech of his presidency, and what is considered by many the greatest speech of any American president. And when you think about just those last few lines, how beautiful, how wonderfully written, when he says that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom and government of the people, by the people, shall not perish from the earth. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, the 2 greatest presidents in American history. This is Phil Easter, the amazing memory man. Thank you. God bless you. God bless America.